The process of nation building has long since occurred in tandem with control of the private life of the country's population. What the qualifications and expectations of citizenship are often bleeds into an attempt to influence the outward actions and portrayal of individuals. Control over sexuality is a common means of obtaining the desired makeup of a revolutionary culture. There are several examples of revolutionary or post-revolutionary countries that have targeted homosexuals or gender transgressive individuals as enemies to the state. They are not seen as productive citizens because they do not contribute to the population of the country, do not form traditional family units, and are seen as threatening to state-dictated culture. Many countries turn to multiplying the population as a means of solidifying their presence in the international arena. For example, early on in the formation of the nation, Argentina implemented policies to increase population size. As Barbara Sutton writes, Argentina needed a larger population to profess politically, culturally, and economically. Citizens are also important for the transmission and affirmation of cultural values and goals. The family unit is especially important as it reinforces gender roles that promote productivity in the workforce as well as reproductivity at home. The state might work to prioritize and even erase non-heterosexual identities in the name of national progress for the sole reason that they are perceived as threatening to this unit of transmittance and stability. The emergence of a larger openly homosexual population within this context of early intense nationalism is read as one that is not productive towards the nation's goals of increasing sheer numbers. In reality, homosexuals were beyond simply being non-productive citizens. They were often not even recognized as legitimate citizens at all, considering that citizenship was tied so closely to reproduction. For example, in Trinidad and Tobago, Jackie Alexander suggests that a particular form of state nationalism exists which finds queer bodies to be a direct threat to national stability and safety. She argues that through policing the sexual, a state may dictate the private life of the citizens in the name of nationalism and furthering the country as a whole. Alexander wrote extensively on the inequalities present in the laws of Trinidad and Tobago that target the activities of queer identities in both the private and the public domain. Under any circumstance, sex between people of the same gender was punishable by law. In this way, the state worked to minimize visibility of the private and public lives of citizens by criminalizing any undesirable sex practices. Cuba was another example of a nation that targeted homosexuals in the creation of a post-colonial national identity. Ernesto Che Guevara's El Hombre Nuevo became a symbol of the new Cuban nation, one that evokes strong images of clear gender roles and heterosexuality such that, as Susana Peña put it, the opposition between the new man and the homosexual was not just implied, but clearly articulated and circulated in political discourse. Homosexuality actually trumped revolutionary support when it came to one's favor with the Cuban revolutionary state. Virgilio Piñera, a well-known author, was fervently in favor of the revolution, but was arrested in 1961 for being overtly homosexual. At this point, the state was more concerned with controlling visibility of homosexuality than whether or not someone was pro-revolution or not. However, the state agenda in revolutionary Cuba, which worked so hard to eliminate visibility of the queer population, had opposite effects in some ways. Of course, physical appearance was a main qualifier for which one would be labeled as homosexual and sent to jail. But gender transgressive clothing, actions, or talk was also considered to be punishable by the subjective observer. Eventually, Castro began a campaign in which this punishment became grounds to export an individual from the country, which in the end produced a more visible homosexual population. From this point on, the state entered a battle of visibility. The desired outcome was achieved, which was fewer visible transgressives. Within Cuba, however, they were lost to the US, where visibility could no longer be controlled in the state by the same way. Peña writes about several drag queens who were well-known performers throughout Miami. Adora and Maritrini, for example, obviously dressed in ways that were not acceptable in Cuba, or not permitted in Cuba at the time, but they were able to bring culture and history of Cuba to fellow Cubans in Miami, gay and straight. These exiles exercised a form of resistance against a repressive revolutionary Cuba, using their geographic position as a platform to increase their visibility and exercise the right to be gender transgressive and Cuban without facing labor camps or jail time. Over the years, solidarity amongst gay communities has become more visible. Visual and specific forms of spoken resistance spoken resistance to forces that would see homosexuality or gender transgressive behavior eliminated, takes advantage of the way in which information travels these days. Independent or otherwise non-censored media sources and radio are forms of communication that are not easily controlled and prove to be effective way to stay in the public eye. Las Crudas is an all-female queer Cuban hip-hop group who serve as an example of resistance through sound. They write on issues of race and gender that work in ways that work against the Cuban state's attempt to portray itself as a country free of these sorts of inequalities. Las Crudas perform internationally, most recently at South by Southwest, and are broadcast on international radio stations as well. The women of Las Crudas challenge cultural beliefs that reinforce gender roles and violence, and they perform every afternoon in Old Havana. But beyond the performance aspect they run a camp that teaches younger children to use performance and public art as a means of expression. And they use the sound and visibility in an important way that is empowering for future and present generations. All of the groups and individuals that work against being made invisible are important to the continued battle of citizenship, equal citizenship. Going back to the beginning of the presentation, which dealt with issues of new emerging national identity, it is possible to see how queer identities have been excluded, but now the question remains is how our sexuality dealt with in modern politics and culture in this nation. This quote is wonderful. It's from a book called Sexual Strangers by Kathleen Jones, and it succinctly explains a problem with modern politics surrounding issues of identity. She goes on to talk about how the state of a given country might promise generic citizenship for everyone, but in exchange for discretion and concealment of undesirable characteristics. This generic citizenship, as she describes, is not a compromise that is equal for everyone. Asking citizens to conceal their sexuality is essentially legislation that seeks to control visibility and private lives of citizens. Also, issues around productivity and prioritization of certain citizens still exist and are not easily addressed or approached in conversation, considering legislation and political change is often halted by opposing organizations or individuals. Wilfred Labiosa, who spoke here recently, is one of many activists who fights for the destruction of repressive legislation that is still in place from revolutionary times in some Caribbean countries. Visibility is not as large an issue in itself as it once was. Instead, it's many laws or practices that have not changed, though the demonstrated state agenda may have. For mere tolerance is not or should not be an end movement for gay rights movements.